Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fish Tank. I'm Bad as Fish 80 and we've got some Minion Masters news to talk about today. A brand new expansion will be dropping. Let's dive right in and find out what's going to be going on. Okay, so here we see some artwork from the new expansion featuring one of the cards that we'll see very shortly. So the new expansion is going to be called Minion Masters Invasion. Sounds fairly pog. Now, what are we going to have? So this is going to be version 1.31, and that's going to drop tomorrow, which is the 6th of January 2022. We're going to have two new cards, we're going to have a new legendary skin, we're going to have some balance changes, and there's going to be some updates to the Elo system. Now, hopefully you're interested in all of these. If you're new to the channel and you haven't subscribed yet, I'd really appreciate it if you smash that subscribe button and drop the video a like if you enjoy what we're doing here in the fish tank. Now, without any further ado, let's jump straight in to the new cards. Okay, the first new card we have here is the Monitor Gnats. Now, let's find out a little bit more about these. So, the Monitor Gnats, this is going to be a 3 mana Outlander defensive spell. You're allowed to have 3 copies of it. Now, this is going to summon 3 gnats to protect a target minion. What are gnats, you ask? Well, gnats are small little Outlander flying ranged minions. They're going to have 15 HP and 10 DPS. So these are just little flying units that are going to support one of your units. Now that could be useful if you've got something, say, like a Colossus that can't hit air. You could support it with these, so then it doesn't get just scrat hoarded to death or something like that. So that's one of the first cards. The next card is going to be Siege Imperator Ruby, or as we're going to call her from this point forth, Ruby. Now, Ruby looks insane. Ruby is an 8 mana Outlander ranged minion, mythic, so you can only have 1 copy out at a time, it can't res. So Ruby's going to have 1000 HP, and as we're going to see in a little bit, she's going to do 40 DPS and be able to attack ground and air, only allowed 1 copy, and will have a range of 6, and importantly a movement rate of 3. So let's find out a little bit more about Ruby. So Ruby's going to attack with the side cannon, so she's got 2 side cannons, each of them can target independently of each other, and the overall damage of those 2 combined is where the 40 DPS comes from. So they're going to have a range of 6, which is the same as something like a stint. So Ruby will spawn and she'll just move towards the enemy. Won't stop for buildings, will only stop for things that taunt her. She also has an ability which is called the Plasma Blast. Now, the Plasma Blast, is basically like a fireball. So if you look at the stats of it, it's a fireball, but it only does half damage to face, so 180 damage. Now, basically what happens when you shoot the Plasma Blast is that Ruby will stop, she will face the target, so there'll be a small period of targeting, and then the spell will be sent off. Now, you can't use the spell directly on top of Ruby because there's a exclusion zone around her. So you can't, if you've got scrats above you, for example, you couldn't just use this spell to clear them. So that's Siege Imperator Ruby. Be very interesting to see how this unit performs. As I said, a huge Outlander ranged minion. We'll look forward to seeing that in the game tomorrow. So those are the 2 new cards. We're going to have a new skin. This time it's going to be Mordar. Mordar's getting a legendary skin, Dark Fury Soul Collector Mordar. And there we see it in all its glory. So we've seen the cards and the skin. Let's talk about the balance changes that are coming in version 1.31. Now, we've got some buffs to start with. First of all, King Puff has been adjusted a few times recently. The birthday cooldown's being reduced a little bit from 45 seconds to 43 seconds. So that's just a little buff to King Puff overall. And now we see an interesting change to Call to Arms. Again, this is something that's been changed. Previously it gave you warriors, then they changed it to give you units based on how much HP of a building was left. Now they've changed it a little bit further. So when you use it, the buildings no longer transform, they will continue. They will generate either a spear thrower, a legionnaire, or a warrior based on how much HP they've got. Now, the copies allowed is reduced from 3 to 1, so you cannot wildcard it. You will no longer get the extra warrior that you normally get from it by your tower, and it can only target your own buildings. So that's an interesting change. Call to arms, not something we've seen very much at all. Perhaps this will change it. Tune in to the next season to find out. Now, Calef Dawnhammer, small health increase, 550 to 600. These are just some units that have been underperforming and the devs feel need a little bit of love. Again, Brothers of Light, health 550 to 600. Right, next we have a buff to Kurnath Crystalback. Remember, he has an ability where if your opponent uses a spell, he will damage the 3 closest previously minions. Now he will target the 3 closest targets, whether that's a minion, a building, or the Master Tower itself. But there's a slight change also that it's not an ability that's active during Summoning Sickness. So that's just something to stop you getting kind of lucky hits if you're putting it down just as your opponent happens to use a spell. Now the next change we have is to Lycanthropy. So this is a change that really only affects once bidden. So Lycanthropy normally activated when the unit it was played on got down to 50% or less HP. Now that's going to change, so it's going to activate on 50% of the health that the unit had when it was given Lycanthropy. So, quick example, imagine you've got a 500 health unit. If you previously gave that once bidden at 250 HP, it would immediately change to a wolf. Whereas with the new setup, if you've got a 500 HP unit that's down to 250 HP, you then play once bidden on it, that once bidden won't trigger until it's down to half that 250, so down to 125. So this just means that it's going to be not quite as easy to trigger the wolves. You can't just throw it on something and get an instant wolf. So it's going to be requiring a little bit more skill to get value out of that. Now, Flightless Dragons, since their cost was increased from 4 to 5, we didn't see them played very much. They've been given now the Voidborn Wound, which means that if a Voidborn minion attacks the tower while this is in your hand, it will generate the wound and reduce the cost of it by 1. So in certain scenarios, it will be back to 4 mana. Now we have a buff to Stun Blast. Again, not something we see too often. Stun Blast here getting the ability to inflict Marked on any of the units that it hits. Now remember, Marked is effectively a taunt for ranged units, forcing the ranged units to attack it, and also a 25% extra DPS for those ranged units. Now we see a change to Stormy. Stormy's attack delay being reduced from 2 seconds to 1.5. So that means that you're more likely to get an attack out if you're spawning it into a bit of a dodgy area, and also once it gets going, you'll be able to get those attacks out more quickly before hopefully it gets countered. Now we're going to see some buffs to basically the overall spawners. So spawners we haven't seen being very useful so far recently in the meta. So Scrat Tunnels, the unit spawn's going to be 5 seconds down to 4 seconds, so you'll get Scrats more often and more of them. Again, the same with the Crossbow Guild, unit spawn 4 seconds down to 3.7 seconds, and again the same with the Swarmer Totems, unit spawn 5.7 seconds down to 5 seconds. Now again, one of the relatively recent cards, the Sapphire Pebble. So with some changes here, so the damage is going to be reduced from 50 to 40, the attack cooldown is going to go down from 2 to 1.4, and the attack delay down from 1 to 0.7. So overall, a nice set of buffs. It's going to be overall increased DPS. Against a bunch of Scrats, it's going to be great because the attack cooldown is less. But one of the big things is it's no longer going to be able to single shot the 50 HP minions in the game. So especially things like the little skeletons that you'll see a lot of in a curse decks, Plasma Marines, things like that, the Sapphire Pebbles will no longer single shot. So whilst their DPS is increased, potentially the way they trade could be reduced in certain scenarios. So that's something to certainly pay in mind. Now we've got the Impatient Statue, again something we don't see too often. It's going to be given an additional cool Slitherbound, so that's going to attach Slitherbounds to another Slither card in your hand. Slither-based decks have been very strong recently. We'll see some of these nerfs coming up that might change. Now the Ghost, again, something that we don't see too often, especially since they changed it where you could no longer ghost a mythic unit. The ghost is getting some love here, so if you use a ghost on a mythic unit, in addition to the stun that it does, it will also curse that unit. So that's going to be great against big mythic units. The scrapyard, simply just being removed from the random pool, so you'll no longer get it as a perk 3 from APEP, which is probably good news for most APEP players. If you've got a few Outlander cards in your deck, maybe it's okay, but generally it's not a great perk 3 in APEP. The same with the future cards as well. You'll no longer be able to get the scrapyard. Right, Poison Strike. So Poison Strike's being given a sacrifice mechanic. So that's sacrificing Slitherbounds. If you sacrifice 2 Slitherbounds, you're going to get an extra 4 seconds of poison. So basically the unactivated damage is going to be 130, and if you use the sacrifice, it's going to be up to 210. So that's a nice little change and potential buff there for the Poison Strike. Now we look at the nerfs. The Grenadier. Okay, the Grenadier is getting a small health reduction from 60 down to 50. Again, it's just a very, very well performing 2 mana card. It has seen some nerfs recently. It's getting another one here, but I'm sure we'll still see it out there, just not trading quite so well. Now here's one that people will probably be very happy with. Hypnotize, one of the strongest performing spells in the game. The duration of the Hypnotize is going to go down from 5 seconds to 4 seconds. So that just means that the effective stun, keeping the enemy units off your units, is reduced, and how much damage they can do to each other as well is reduced. So hopefully that should bring Hypnotize back into a healthy state. Pincer of Dread, again another high performing spell. The damage threshold, or the damage, is going to be reduced from 130 to 100. And that's important because it will no longer kill specific things like the Fire Imp, Stun Lancers, Wizard Puffs, or War Dancers. So if you've been using the Pincer of Dread, you do need to have a second thought about what you're using it on. Is it still going to kill it like it would before? Now, Brother of the Burning Fist, again a very meta card recently, getting a slight nerf where the Armor of Holy Fire, that's where he drops the Holy Fire on the floor to both heal himself and damage, or heal himself and his friends and damage the enemies, is going to have a 2-second additional cooldown, 12 seconds to 14 seconds. Now the Scrap Pack, simply having the amount of scrats you get reduced from 5 to 4, so just not quite as effective as before. Scrat Horde, the count of the scrats down from 10 to 8. Now on the surface this might not seem like a big deal, but I've certainly used and seen used Scrat Hordes in Volco decks, and when you get Berserker Rage at perk 3 on Scrat Hordes, those things can shred. So by losing 2 of them for the Scrat Horde, that's certainly going to be an overall DPS reduction in that scenario. Now, the Warrior. Now the attack speed is going to be increased, so that's an overall DPS nerf. Only 2 seconds to 2.1, just a small nerf. But of course, there's a lot of cards based on the Warrior, so as well as this card getting nerfed, you're going to see a slight nerf to the Divine Warrior, Call to Arms as well if it's generating Warriors, and Raging Reinforcements. Stun Lancers, again another strong meta card, especially in Slither decks. Their stun duration is reduced from 5 seconds down to 4, so not quite as effective as before. And again, another card that we saw in a lot of the Slither decks, health reduced from 230 to 200 for the Musketeer. And a lot of the Slither decks were based on the Slithering Summons, and that is also received a bit of a reduction here. The cool Slitherbound has been removed from it. Now, that's important. I think we can see there a lot of the nerfs were particularly to cards that were in the Slither faction, which were really a strong faction in the meta, so it's nice to see the devs responding to that and trying to reduce that so that people don't feel like they have to play that if they want to keep up with the meta. So those are the buffs and the nerfs. We've got just a little bit to talk about with the Elo system. I've seen a lot of discussion about the Elo system. The Elo system, of course, is now in charge of matchmaking and calculating how many points you get for winning and losing. And some people have had an awkward experience with that, so there's going to be some changes that will hopefully improve those situations where the current system was not working very well. So there's going to be a reduced acceptable Elo range for a match. So that means that the system's going to work harder to find opponents, teammates, etc. of a similar level to you. Now, the offshoot of these changes is there may be a slightly increased wait time, but for me, and I'm sure for most of you, that's by far an acceptable trade-off. And the other adjustment is going to be a system in place to prevent a very high Elo player getting paired with a very low Elo player in randoms. Because basically what happens is, if you're very highly ranked on the Elo system in randoms, the system's trying to find an opponent and a teammate of an appropriate level. Because it can't find a team for you to play at your high level, it's looking for a lower ranked team, and then to reduce the Elo of your team to be at the average the same as your opponents, it has to find a low Elo ranked player. So hopefully the changes will stop that happening. And it was that scenario where if you won a game, you'd get very few points because you were very highly ranked, and if you lost the game, you would get very, very punished by losing a lot of points. So hopefully a couple of changes there that will really help the experience of the Elo system in the game with the matchmaking and the points given and taken. So just a very quick overview there. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We got some new cards, new skin, a bunch of balance changes, and some updates to the Elo system. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments what you thought about it, what you thought about the changes, what do you like, what you don't like, what do you think of the new cards. And I'll look forward to seeing you again soon here in the fish tank, and also live on stream. We'll be live tomorrow checking out the updates. This is Bad as Fish 80 signing out. Take care.